All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to Hot Technologies. Yes, indeed. My name is Eric Cavanaugh. I will be your moderator for today's event. And folks, we have some exciting stuff mapped out for you today. I can tell you right now, this is one of the more fascinating areas of IT management in general. The topic is Keep It Simple, Best Practices for IT Portfolio Management. We're going to focus largely on the data side of that equation today. In other words, making sure your data is clean or as clean as possible as you try to understand the landscape of devices all over your enterprise. And of course, with this whole new world of BYOD, bring your own device, there's yours truly very quickly, we have really heterogeneous landscapes these days. I mean, those of you in large organizations know the stories. There are whole rooms filled with servers. There are applications that have been running for years. There are old IT systems that no one has touched in 10 years, and everyone's afraid to turn off because you never know what's going to happen. So we're going to talk today with a couple experts, in fact 4 experts total, about what to do in this space. So, Hot Technologies, the whole purpose of this show is really to dig deep into specific kinds of technology and help our audience understand how things work, why to use these kinds of technologies, what some best practices are, what you should consider. We'll tell some use cases on occasion. In fact, Des is going to talk about a little story from his experience in the world of IT asset management. But again, we're going to kind of focus on the data side because that's really the expertise of our friends from BDNA. They're masters at helping organizations really get a handle on what exactly they have in their environment and how to understand where it is, what it does, who's using it, all that kind of fun stuff. So here are our panelists. We'll hear from Des Blanchfield, our newly minted data scientist. I like to brag that Des was literally one of the top 10 most visited LinkedIn profiles of Australia last year. That's because he never sleeps. We also have Dr. Robin Bloor, our very own chief analyst. Dr. Bloor, for those of you who don't know, really kind of started the whole IT independent analyst industry in the UK about 25 years ago. These days, there are quite a few. It's almost, like I say, a cottage industry. There are lots of independent IT analyst firms. You also have Gartner and Forrester and IDC and the big guys. But the nice thing about the independent firms is that, frankly, we're a little bit more free to speak candidly about stuff. So ask him the hard questions. Don't let these guys off easy. You can always ask a question during the show by using the Q&A component of your webcast console. That's in the lower right-hand corner. Or you can chat me. Either way, I try to monitor that chat window all show long. And with that, let's introduce Des Blanchfield. And Des, I'm going to hand you the keys to the WebEx. And there you go. Take it away.
Thank you, Eric. Great. Always fantastic intro. So the topic today is something that I've lived with for the better part of nearly 30 years. Large IT environments, they grow through an organic process. As Eric said, you know, you start out small and you build these environments and they grow organically. In some cases, they might grow through other means such as large expansion or acquisition. I'm going to share an anecdote that touches on all the key things we're talking about today, and in particular data and where the data comes from to do, and the collection of that data to do IT asset management. In this case, I'm going to talk about a large piece of work for one of the top 3 publishers in the world. They're in radio, TV, magazine, newspaper, print, digital, and a range of other publishing spaces. And we were given a 3-month window to run what was essentially called a cloud readiness assessment, but it ended up being an entire business-wide cloud strategy that we put together. We were given this fundamental challenge from the CIO to reduce the data center footprint by 70% within 3 years. And it was pretty obvious that to do this, we had to do a whole business cloud transition. So we had 3 months to do this piece of work. It covered 4 different regions in 5 countries. There were 6 separate business units that were included and 7 different incumbents as far as service providers. And so as the title said, nothing beats a real-world example. So we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that the business goals were, frankly, nothing short of a miracle. They wanted to consolidate their own data centers. They wanted to leverage third-party data center environments where necessary, but in general, they wanted to move to somebody else's cloud infrastructure, particularly public cloud or virtual private clouds where necessary for security reasons. In particular, Amazon Web Services and Azure were focused on because they were quite the most mature at the time. They ran a mixture of the Intel x86 32 and 64-bit platforms, IBM's I-Series, the AS series, the AS400s, P-Series, mainframes. They actually had two mainframes, one for production, one for disaster recovery and development. And they had the whole mix of operating systems, Windows, Linux, AOX, Solaris, and various things on laptops and desktops. Storage was one of the biggest challenges. They had an enormous amount of data because they're a publisher, everything from photographs to video to edited images and text and content. So we had these big platforms and different storage formats with NetApp, Hitachi, IBM, EMC. So an extremely diverse environment to try and capture and map the different types of services that were in there and just get a view of what we were taking from on-premise and private data center environments to a cloud environment. So the heart of what we're talking about today around the IT asset management piece is driven by data in essence. And here's a map of what we had to deal with this particular project that I'm sharing the anecdote about. We had a lot of data coming at us. There were plenty of inputs, but unfortunately none of them were really in very good shape. We had a range of incomplete asset registers. There were 5 different asset registers being run, so configuration management databases, ITSM platforms. We had disparate data sources that ranged up to 90-odd different types. We had multiple core service models, conflicting service groups. One of the largest community of stakeholders I've ever dealt with in my career. There was over 400 senior execs who were in charge of these different systems. And invariably, for all intents and purposes, we had completely misaligned business entities. Each of them were operating independently with their own environments and their own infrastructure in some cases. It was quite a challenge. And we discovered this within about the second or third day that we were just being fire-hosed with data that almost made no sense. And so it was becoming increasingly obvious that we had to do something slightly different. So the initial approach was we simply threw bodies at it. This is a classic IT approach in my experience. Just get more humans and run faster and it'll all work out in the end. So we ran lots of workshops in the early days with the domain experts trying to just capture a model of what the business looked like, what the service groups were, what services were in place, what systems were they dependent on, and the infrastructure and any data around that infrastructure, routers and switches and servers and apps and data within those apps and control groups and governance. And we started mapping the business requirements, but in the process of doing the application discovery and trying to capture some performance data and validate that data and produce some reports around it, it became very obvious to us that we weren't even going to remotely come close to meeting this tiny deadline of 3 months to complete this piece of work. So the throwing bodies at it didn't work, and so we decided to build a system, and we couldn't find at that stage, just a number of years ago, we couldn't find a tool that suited our purpose, and we looked long and hard. And so we ended up building a SharePoint platform with a number of databases feeding it with a series of workflows in different stages. And we went back to the fundamentals just to get access to data that made sense so we could validate. So we used a range of tools to map the ecosystems that were running. We ran automated audits of the data center in physical and logical infrastructure. We did automated discovery tools, mapping the services running within those data centers and environments. We did full scans of applications, looking for everything from what applications are running and their configuration, what ports they're sitting on, what IP addresses they're on. And what we did is we built a new single source of truth, because each of the other databases and information collections they had around their environments of configuration and assets just didn't ring true, and we couldn't map reality back to it. So we ended up building this new single source of truth. And so we went from throwing bodies at it to throwing automated tools at it, and we started to see some light at the end of this tunnel. So we ended up with what was a very, very sophisticated system, and it did some enormously clever things, from capturing automated log analysis through to data that was being thrown at us from various systems, monitoring security controls, username and login password controls, physical infrastructure auditing, application auditing, and we built a series of things inside that to then analyze that data and provide automated scorecards. We then produced reports around suitability and percentage ranking and whether applications were or were not a good fit for cloud. We then ran a baseline of that scorecard across Amazon Web Services and Azure and VMware models, and then we produced a series of reports and financial dashboards on this. and almost never did we allow any manual override. So essentially what we got to the point was an automated system that was self-maintaining, and we really didn't need to touch this thing. Very rarely did we override it manually. And this thing grew a life of its own, and we finally had the single source of truth of real data that we could drill down from service groups to services, the systems running around, the applications, the data, and the users, and the services being delivered. And it was quite exciting because we had the ability now to deliver on the promise of this 3-month project. And the scale of this project, just to put some context around this, was that we ended up, I think it was around about $110 million year on year was slashed off the bottom line, the operating P&L, once we completed this transition to shifting the majority of their infrastructure from their own data centers to the cloud. So it's a very large scale program. And so we got this great outcome for the project, but the real issue we ran into was we created a home-baked system, and there was no vendor behind it at stage. As I said, it was a number of years ago. There was no vendor behind it to continue developing it and provide maintenance support for it. The small team of about 30 people who helped develop it and gather all the data and feed this monster eventually moved on to other projects, and 2 or 3 people were left with it. But we ended up with a situation where we didn't have a mature managed IT asset management solution. We had a one-off for a project. And the business made it very clear that they already thought they had configuration management databases and ITSM tools mapping their world, despite the fact that we had stood on top of a very big soapbox and screamed at the top of our voice that data didn't make any sense. And we demonstrated it by having to build a tool to run the project. And so the unfortunate outcome of this exciting yet sad at the end story was that the outcome for the project was very, very successful. It was a resounding success. We pulled $100+ million off their bottom line year on year. But what we've done is we've created this Frankenstein, this really powerful system that could collect data and provide reporting on it in real time in some cases, but there was no one there to maintain it. And so the business kind of just let it run for a while, and until eventually the data wasn't being used by anyone, and then changes came about, and it wasn't able to collect data from systems that got changed. And eventually, over time, this home-baked system was left to die, and along with the data that was with it. And so we had this scenario where they went back to exactly what they had in the first place, which is disparate silos of disparate data sets, looking very, very closely in a niche form into a particular area of service or service groups and solving their problem. But they lost that organization-wide, and there's about 74 different companies in the group. They lost all that value. And oddly enough, some 2 or 3 years later, they've realized what they lost, and now they're having to look at how they solve this problem again. And so the moral of the story is that if it were the case that there was a product that we could have gotten off the shelf at the time a number of years ago, we would have definitely bought that, but we had to build one. But that's no longer the case anymore. There are products out there, as we're about to see, that can do this, and they can do it in an automated fashion. They can clean up all the data. They can take multiple data sets and merge them and dedupe them. They can take really obvious things to humans and spreadsheets of things that it would say Microsoft version 1, version 1.1, version 1.0.1, and just call them Microsoft. But at the time we built this tool, that sort of thing wasn't available, and so we had to do a lot of build to get that capability. So I'm looking forward to seeing the detail of what this platform we're about to hear today does, because I only wish that we had it back then. It would have saved us a lot of grief, and we could have saved a lot of time and effort and development for an off-the-shelf platform that could be maintained by somebody who continues to develop and grow the platform, makes it available for general consumption. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Eric.
All righty, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Robin Bloor. Robin, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, actually that's kind of an interesting story there, Des. I like that. And it doesn't actually strike me as particularly unusual. Every time I've run into the IT asset management problem, it's always been that a company actually went out and did something when it had to, but it never seems that you run into an organization that has the whole thing under control. And yet, as far as I can tell, if you aren't managing the IT assets, you're burning money. Since Des came up with a nitty-gritty story, I thought that I would just do the overview of, well, really, what is asset management? You know, what does that actually mean? And so this is the bird's eye view or the eagle's eye view. Consider a factory. You know, especially organizations that run factories, with the intention of making a profit. You know, everything possible is done to make maximum utilization of the expensive assets deployed. It's just the case, you know. Now consider a data center, and well, not so much. In fact, mostly not at all. You know, and then you kind of think, well, how much is there invested in a data center? Well, you know, if you actually work it out, it's really, really large amount of money. If you put together the, I don't know, the historical efforts of everybody that built the systems, or the licenses that are paid for the software, and the value of the data and the cost of the data center itself, and of course all of the hardware, it normally comes out to be tens of millions. Well, it depends on how big the organization is, but easily tens of millions for most organizations. This is a huge investment people make in IT. Certainly in any large organization, it's massive. And the idea that you shouldn't really particularly bother to get maximum value out of it, and that it should be run efficiently, is obviously an absurdity. But we haven't, you know, as an industry, there are very few places that have actually had the discipline to actually really, truly manage the IT assets. This is a model I've used, I don't know, quite a long, many times, I guess. It's what I call the diagram of everything. If you look at an IT environment, it has users, it has data, it has software, it has hardware. There's a relationship between all of these fundamental entities that make up an IT environment. Users make use of specific software, there's a relationship there. They have access to specific data, there's a relationship there. They use specific hardware resources, so there's a relationship there. Software and software and data are intricately related. The software resides and is executed on specific hardware, and the data resides on specific hardware. So there's all of these relationships. And if you want to know what the IT assets are, just put your hand over the users, because there's very little that's actually you could call an IT asset apart from acquired skills amongst users. And it's everything else. And then you look at that and you see, well, how many organizations even have an inventory of all the software that's used on all of the systems that they employ? How many of them even have a proper inventory of hardware that includes all the networking capabilities? How many have any meaningful inventory of the data? And the answer is none. You know, I mean, really is none. And yet, knowing what this stuff is and knowing how one relates to another can be very, very important in certain instances, particularly in the kind of instance that Des just described, where you're going to pick it up and move it all, or pick it up and move most of it. It's not a trivial thing, and just actually knowing what's there is a big deal. You know, never mind actually knowing how one thing relates to another. And then the other thing is this diagram applies at the smallest level of granularity you can imagine, the smallest piece of software, accessing the smallest amount of data you can imagine running on a trivial piece of hardware resource, right up to, you know, an ERP system with a huge, massive amount of distinct databases and data files running on multiple pieces of hardware. You know, this diagram generalizes everything and it applies every level of granularity. And this arrow of time that goes underneath just indicates that, and all of this stuff is dynamic. Because it might look like it's a still diagram, but it's not. It's moving. Everything's changing. And keeping track of that is no trivial thing. I mean, it just isn't. You can expand this. I just add this slide for kind of interest sake. You know, you can expand this diagram and you can say, well, actually, let's forget computers and just make it even wider. You know, businesses consist of all data plus business information that might not be electronically stored. Various facilities that are not necessarily computer related. various business processes that are not necessarily software dependent or partially maybe independent of software. And lots of people, not just users of the system, but staff, partners, customers, and so on. That makes up the ecosystem of a business. And then you actually have, humanity as a whole. Well, as people, as all the information in the world, there's civilization and all of its, let's call it hard stuff, and all human activities, So this diagram, that's the diagram of all and everything. That diagram, gives you an indication of how interrelated from the smallest collection of things that do anything in computer terms to the largest, because in terms of humanity, there is just like the whole of the internet and the billions of computers that now make it up, and all of the devices and so on and so forth. Well, that's a vast array of things, and all of that is obviously subject to the arrow of time. So that's the bird's eye view. I just listed these straight out of the top of my head without even thinking about it. Dimensions of IT asset management. There's an asset registry, hardware, software, data, and networking. There's asset attribute capture. Do you have all the data relating to all of that stuff? Asset usage. Why does the stuff exist at all? Asset acquisition costs and ownership costs. How much to cost, and therefore how much is the ownership and how much to replace would probably be a good idea. So that brings in the idea of asset depreciation. And I'm not just talking about the hardware, we're also talking about the software and possibly the data as well. A complete asset map, which would be to instantiate the diagram that I just discussed. Cloud assets, stuff that isn't actually on-premise, but actually does in one way or another belong to the organization by virtue of rental, if by no other reason. Service management targets and how they relate to all of these particular possibilities. I mean, one of the things, as Des was talking about his effort to move a collection of systems from one place to another place was just like, how did the service management work out in terms of, did you hit the targets that people are expecting for the performance of the systems, and so on. Then there's risk and compliance, things that in one way or another the shareholders that might be concerned about and government itself might be concerned about. And all of that, is an aspect of asset management. Then there's the procurement and licensing of all software. And there's business performance objectives. And there's a whole of asset governance in terms of whatever rules the organization might set for any of these things. We are talking about a really complex set of stuff. And so the question arises, and this is where I finish, how much of this can be done and how much of it actually should be done?
All right. And with that, let's find out what the experts have to say. I'm going to pass it over to Tom Bosch. Stand by. Giving you the keys to the WebEx. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Eric. I will move into the BD&A portion here. So the title of the WebEx, from our perspective, was about keeping it simple and obviously best practices for IT portfolio or IT asset management. So anytime you say best practices, it is ultimately an opinion, and it's an approach from our perspective. And ultimately what BD&A wants to do is help many of the companies out there that we find are still just getting their feet wet back down the IT journey path. IT asset management was a hot topic back right around Y2K for some of you who've been in the industry for a while. And the primary reason was I need to understand if the software that I have and the systems that I have are going to need to be replaced or updated, or will they fail when we hit the new millennium. And I think what we all lived through that estranged evening some 16 years ago was the fact that actually very little went down in the background. Our power plants stayed alive, and the trains kept running, and the lights in New York City and Sydney stayed on. through that process, people began to understand that there was an enormous amount of information that needed to be gathered.
Just hearing some weird background noise. Go ahead.
And then ultimately, it was the data behind all of that had to be cleansed, as Des said earlier, to be able to make the kinds of decisions that people were looking for. So that's the thrust of our conversation today. And I think every single one of us realized that every day we walk into our IT departments, every day that we walk into our organizations, enterprise information technology is just almost out of control. And what I mean by that is that there are new servers being brought online. There are new pieces of software being deployed from department to department to department across organizations, whether you're in the manufacturing business, you're in a services organization, you're in retail. Every single one of our organizations today are not only being run, but they're being driven. IT is becoming the production engine of many of the organizations that we work in. And that becomes no more apparent than by looking at the solutions that are being deployed. So if we just focus internally on the complexity of the data just inside the IT department, right? Just the applications that are being utilized to ultimately support IT, we've got everything from vendor management systems to ITSM, portfolio management, procurement systems, architecture, security systems. And one of the key attributes of all of these is that they need to utilize essentially an inventory of what you've got inside your environment to be able to effectively drive solutions in their specific disciplines. So having those assets at hand is critical for almost every discipline inside the IT organization. But one of the things that is quickly found when companies begin to try to bring these different systems together is they don't talk the same language. And ultimately, it boils down to the data. So as Des pointed out earlier, bad data was the root of the project that they started with. And some very interesting statistics that have come from Gartner are that literally IT is wasting over 25% of the money that they invest on an annual basis because of bad data. It's costing 10x projects because ultimately, for most companies, it's a matter of cleaning up that data manually. And again, as Des said, it's throwing bodies at it. Specifically around asset management itself and in general across IT projects, Gartner basically concluded that over 40% of all IT projects fail because of bad data. So we know the root of the problem, it's the data. So how do we begin to manage that? Well, one of the things that's going on is that ITAM is becoming important again to organizations for more than just one reason. Obviously, the one that we just talked about, and that is that we need to get systems talking to each other. We need to understand where these systems exist inside our organization so that we can do simple operations like refresh or upgrades to just the systems that we have in place. But to further enhance the problem in today's environment, many of the software publishers and manufacturers are finding that there is, well, we'll call it what it is, low-hanging fruit for these publishers by coming in and simply forcing clients through an audit or a true-up. Literally 63% of the Fortune 2000 went through at least a single audit in 2015, according to Independent Research Corporation. And those audits are costing companies an enormous amount of internal fees and external true-up costs, anywhere from $100 $500,000 to $1 million. And Gartner essentially came out with another interesting statistic. It's not in my presentation, but I picked it up early this morning, that they consider the average cost of an audit at somewhere around $500,000 for an organization. So when we talk about 25% of the dollars being spent in IT being wasted, these are some of the examples that are going out. So I think the thrust of all this is, so what do we do? So how do we tackle this, right? Well, it starts by really understanding what this journey is for most organizations. IT asset management is a series of steps that basically starts with discovering what I've got out in my on my networks. And most people have one or some or many of these discovery tools. Probably one of the most common discovery tools in the marketplace is SCCM. Most corporations that have any level of Microsoft and Windows-centric environments utilize SCCM for many purposes, deploying applications, and can also be used for discovering data. But that data comes back in a muddy, messy format. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. But there are numerous other tools as well. Most of the ITSM solutions, whether it's BMC or ServiceNow or HP, have very good discovery tools. And those often come into play when you're especially trying to pull together the information and the interdependencies of your server networks and networking devices. Because the last thing we need is a situation where the registration or the booking system for a large airline goes down in the middle of the day and millions, if not billions of dollars of revenue are lost. So understanding how those things are all connected starts again by understanding the assets that are associated with that. So the second phase or the second step in this process, I've got all this data, but what does it mean and how can I begin to work with it? That step is typically referred to as normalization, and it's one that we will focus on to a great deal today because at its core, it's the simplest and most important step in moving towards a fully optimized or a fully mature ITAM journey. As you move through that process of normalization, ultimately what you're trying to do is pull together all the different discovery sources you have. And some of those may be simply the applications and solutions that we talked about in one of the earlier slides. We want to deduplicate it. We want to reduce all the buzz and filter out all of the data that's not relevant. We'll talk about that more as we go along. From there, some of the logical steps are to tackle the low-hanging fruit. As corporations come together and merge and go out and acquire other organizations, they begin to develop duplication in the applications that they utilize. So a very typical step that people take once they understand the landscape of software and hardware that they have is to rationalize or remove the duplication, the redundant devices and redundant software in their environment. For instance, you might find that if you go out and look, you may have as many as 20 or 25 different BI tools in use across your environment. And the potential savings there for a corporation to remove not only those that are associated with specific applications, but more importantly, those that have broader reaches offers some tremendous cost savings and potential risk reduction. The next logical step is, well, I know what I've got, but am I entitled to everything that I've got? Let's match it up against what we purchased and make sure that we remain in compliance. As you move further along in the maturity curve, applying some of the easy steps, the easy automation steps like refresh and reharvesting and managing a retirement process are also typically associated with the ITAM journey. And finally, for the most mature organizations in the marketplace, they find that there are opportunities for them to put governance in place and begin to actually apply the usage rights that are associated with the software titles that they have in their environment. But again, the journey starts with what I have and ultimately ends with what am I entitled to from a deployment perspective. So what do organizations do? They typically take a look at this in large detail, and as Des said, you get a lot of bodies thrown at it, and they start figuring out what they need to do and how do they get to this optimized state, and I watch it happen time and time again. I've worked with hundreds of corporations over the better part of the last decade with their software asset management specifically, and ultimately what stops most of these projects, or what causes most of these projects to fail, is they try to bite off more than they can chew, and they don't take it back to its core roots without creating essentially projects that require an enormous amount of change management, management authorization, education programs, and governance that affects an enormous space across their environment. So when you sit down with a program or a project of that nature in front of a senior executive, oftentimes the question is asked, is the problem really this big? And as I've discussed this in more detail with many senior executives, they say, you know, Tom, it really boils down to three things for me. I want to know what we have. I want to know that we're using what we've purchased. And most importantly, I want to know that what we're using and what we've deployed matches up with what I've bought. In other words, am I entitled to what I'm utilizing, or and I got myself into a case of piracy, albeit non-intentional piracy. And those three questions can actually be answered very easily by going back and just simply cleaning up the data. And that's where we're going to take you the rest of the way. So let's take a look at the data specifically and what some of the problems are that comes out of these discovered data. It's irrelevant, it's inaccurate, it's inconsistent, it's incomplete, and ultimately it's costing corporations well in excess of $14 million annually in poor decision making. So here's an example of the type of data that you get coming straight out of a discovery tool such as SCCM. It involves an enormous amount of really irrelevant data. In fact, 95% of the data is irrelevant. It includes things like executables and patches and hot fixes and device firmware and different language packs and knowledge base packs. A good example is go take a look at the inventory on a typical PC inside your environment and look for something from Adobe. Oftentimes, Adobe Acrobat may have one licensable copy on your PC, but yet there may be as many as 9 or 10 ghost copies and upgrade copies. And so to the naked eye, you're not certain if you have liability for 9 different copies or just one product. One of the second areas of dirty data, so to speak, is the inconsistency that takes place. This is just a brief example of how Microsoft can be named so many different things inside an organization. And as this is a focus area for BD&A, I think one of the most telling examples that we can give is that right around the topic of SQL, we have found across our customer base 16,000 different variations of how SQL can be named inside an inventory. So consider cleaning that up on a consistent basis. Another area is basic lack of standards. To what level database releases, to what level of CALs and PDUs with IBM are we going to manage this data? So this is part of the conundrum and issue of helping normalize all of this raw material, all of this raw data to a point where it's usable. Along with that, there's an enormous amount of data that's not discoverable that would also be very valuable to someone in a traditional ITAM environment. And we'll give you some examples of that as we go along, as we cover some use cases. But the one element that is certainly without question is the fact that this data changes daily. If you just take a look at Microsoft alone, and for some reason the slide lost the values, but if you have those two values in there, Microsoft in 2015 introduced over 3,500 new software titles and upgraded or updated some 9,800 different pieces of software. That's 14,000 changes at Microsoft alone. BD&A manages this on a daily basis. We've got a team of engineers who stay up with this and literally make upwards of 1 million changes to our master dictionary or encyclopedia. And we'll cover that here in more detail as we go along. So ultimately, we take a look at that environment that we looked at earlier, and the inability for all of these different solutions to talk to each other is definitely an issue. And that's where BD&A comes into place. And the BD&A platform and its core component, Technopedia, allow us to create a common data platform. How that takes place is actually quite simple. We aggregate the data that's coming from a number of your different discovery sources. And those discovery sources may be some of the ones I mentioned earlier, like SCCM or ADDM or HPUD. It might be existing CMDBs. And it might actually also be the purchase order systems that you have from your procurement systems. We bring that together and we look at the core components and how things are listed and rationalize and normalize that against something that BD&A calls Technopedia. Technopedia is the world's largest encyclopedia of IT assets. It's utilized by some 20 other applications across the globe outside of just BD&A's usage to, again, create a common language. Tools like architectural tools, procurement tools, service management tools. Again, the idea being, let's speak a common language across all of our IT needs. We then add to those specific titles, the 1.3 million entries, over 87 million attributes. And those attributes might be something as simple as what are the hardware specifications or the specifications around a simple server? What are the physical dimensions? What are the energy usage? What is the energy rating? What is the BTUs of heat generated by it? All things that might be utilized by your architects. And that's just one example of many different catalog items that are available. So we take your data, we aggregate it, we essentially map it out, normalize it against the Technopedia catalog, and deliver a normalized set of data that then can be consumed across the rest of your environment. We feed that into a data warehouse internally that we'll show you in just a few minutes, but we also have standard integrations into many CMDB, ITSM, and additional tools that are utilized across the IT environment to help those solutions become more valuable to you. So a simple example of some of the content packs are pricing, hardware specifications. Life cycle and support is probably the most common. That gives you things like end of life and end of support, virtualization compatibility, Windows compatibility, and again, Chris will cover some of that as we move along. So in a recent cartoon that I picked up, a Dilbert cartoon, he had actually been asked by his boss to do this exact same thing. Dilbert, give me a list of the assets inside our organization. Dilbert's response was, well, who's going to use it if I deliver it? Well, the use of IT asset management data, as we've kind of talked about going forward here, really will reach an enormous amount of usage across your organization. This is just a small sampling of the different disciplines inside an IT organization and how they would utilize it. The reality is it drives value inside the organization. And by taking some of the best authoritative enterprise data, BDNA essentially helps companies drive better business decisions. So as you're going and sitting down and you're looking for a simplified way to tackle your ITSM solution, what BDNA ultimately does is help you drive simplicity by cleaning up the data and giving you the opportunity to make good business decisions. And we do it fast. Most of our customers, in fact, over 50%, have told us through independent research that they received a full ROI on their project in less than 30 days. And literally 66% received over 200% ROI in the first year. Those are the kind of statistics that your CFO and your CIO will certainly want to hear if you're considering ways to invest and improve your organization. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn things over to Chris. We've got the better part of 13 or 15 minutes. What we're going to do is essentially walk through some use cases that are critical and some that we talked about earlier. Basically, what have I got installed? Do I have an opportunity to see what I'm using so that I can potentially reharvest those? Am I compliant with what I have installed? Maybe I want to take a look at which devices are over 3 years old because I want to know if I can refresh those devices. What software are on those devices so that I can plan for that refresh process? And if I want to take a look at security risk and specifically what potential software components have an end of life that's I've either already exceeded or is coming sometime in the next 30 days or within the next year, and which might be listed on the National Institute's Securities Vulnerability List. Eric, what I'd like to do now is pass it back to you, and if you would, can you please hand things to Mr. Russick?
I will do that, and Chris, you should have the floor now. Go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. All righty. So for our demo today, I would like to introduce to you BDNA Analyze. BDNA Analyze is the reports section of our BDNA products. And let's start answering some of those questions that Tom brought to the table. What do we have? You know, who's using or what are we using our products? What are we entitled to, and are we secure? So for the first one, let's talk about Microsoft products. What do we have installed? And for that, I'm going to start by bringing over our software install count. Next, I'm going to come and filter down software manufacturers to Microsoft. All right. Next, I'm going to bring over, for a complete inventory position, the software name, and let's just start with the major version. All right. So again, this is basically the Microsoft inventory position, both licensable and non-licensable products. All right. So where the rubber meets the road is really going to be where the licensable products are. So let's filter this down even further to licensable products. All right. And we're going to start by answering what was, let's again filter this further to Microsoft Project even. It's an expensive title. And say, when was this last used and by whom? And try and reclaim some of those licenses by doing a software reharvest. So next, we're going to come down to last used years, and we'll filter that. I'll choose the 2012 and 2013. Now this is bringing in SCCM's metered data. And what we can do at this point is bring over the software last used date. Finally, we can come down to the host name and bring that over. And we'll also bring over the last full user login. And, oh, it's already in there. Alrighty, so from this report, you can simply go to, Mr. Acme user and ask them, are you going to use Microsoft Project this year? It seems you haven't used it since 2013. The simple report, nobody gets offended by it, and you're able to reclaim those licenses. Next up, I'm going to jump over to our software compliance dashboard. I have this one preloaded. And this one contains, for our example, Adobe data. which applications are we compliant with, which are we not compliant with, and is there an estimate of what we will owe them? Okay, those were the questions that Tom had brought up earlier. So based on your purchase order information, we've brought in, and your discovered information, we've brought in your software titles, your entitlement counts, what the cost is of that, what's installed, and whether or not you're under or over, okay? So by looking at this report, you can answer many of those questions. The next I'd like to jump over to is the hardware refresh. And the intent here is to determine what hardware is out of date, what's more than 3 years old or 4 years old, whatever your organization deems is important. So we're going to bring over your system count. And for this example, we're going to focus on desktops. So I'm going to come up here to the software products information, and we'll bring in category, subcategory, and we will keep only the desktops. From here, we'll bring over the product, manufacturer, and model information. And for today's example, we're going to focus on these 790s, okay? And the reason I need to do this is because we know that these are more than 3 years old by bringing over the GA, the hardware GA year, okay? Excuse me, that belongs over here. If you wanted to find out this GA year, you could certainly bring it across for all of the hardware and subcategory products. Finally, if you are going to do an upgrade or a refresh to these devices, it's helpful to find out what the devices are. So we'll, again, come down to the host name. And then furthermore, it's helpful to understand what's installed on them. So bring over the software install count. And this is where the report gets large. We're going to bring over the software manufacturers, software names, and finally, software major version. If we don't need the hardware category or subcategory anymore, we can save a little bit of space here. Get rid of those. So at this point, we understand that on this host, we've got these products that will be need to be upgraded as part of this hardware refresh. So at this point, we need to know what's compatible with the new operating system. So we're going to bring in a software readiness field. That's going to be the software Windows readiness 64-bit. We're going to go to a 64-bit environment. At this point, you've got truly actionable data. You know what's installed on what host that you do need to upgrade based on the GA date. And furthermore, you're able to tell whether it's compatible or there needs to be a compatibility check or it's simply not compatible. This gives your teams that are going to be doing those hardware refreshes valuable information and saves them time in the long run. Finally, for the security, there's two pieces of security that are tremendously helpful when speaking of hardware and software assets in production environments. First is the end-of-life data, okay? Certainly want to have all your patches updated and your software end-of-life products up to the latest version for obvious reasons. So we'll tackle that first. Again, we're going to start with the software install count. We're going to bring over your entire environment. We'll bring over software manufacturer, software name, and major version again. Next, what we're going to do is come down and limit the end-of-life data to the, let's see here, software end-of-life year. We're going to filter this. We're going to do the current year, the previous, we'll say 2 years, and the next 2 years. So we're going to do a 5-year span. The intent here is to paint a picture of what do we need to upgrade this year, what should we have upgraded in the past 2 years, and to stay ahead of the game, what do we need to plan for the next 2 years? So we'll bring this data and put it across the top. Let that refresh. So right off the bat, you can see that in 2014, there were 346 installations of, looks like, BlackBerry desktop software, personal vDisk from Citrix, there's 25, et cetera, okay? So this is a good report. Again, won't go through all the steps, but you can certainly, select only the desktop software, keep only, and then find out those hosts where it's installed. You can export this data to a CSV, PDF, or Excel. Thereby, if it's a CSV, certainly can bring that into other products as well if you want to do any upgrades through an automated fashion. And from a planning perspective, you can see exactly what needs to be done out in the future. Finally, another report that I've created in our system using BDNA Analyst is a system report based on specific CVEs from the NIST database, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So what I've done here is I've targeted Apple iTunes. I've specifically called out some CVEs from 2015, and I've tried to create a report that looks for the specific version, how many systems we have installed, and how many, systems affected, and how many software components that are installed based on these CVEs, okay? Again, this is a great tool if you're trying to get to a zero-day vulnerability remediation point, or simply help your IT security department better manage their IT assets and the inventory. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Tom and Eric for Q&A.
All right, let me bring in the analysts first and foremost. Des and Robin, I'm sure you've got some questions. That was a fantastic demo, by the way. I'm kind of just finding myself amazed at the amount of visibility you can get into these environments. And let's face it, in these really heterogeneous ecosystems, that kind of visibility is what you need to have if you're going to understand what's going on out there and if you're going to face an audit, which of course no one wants to do. But Des, I guess first I'll turn it over to you for any questions that you've got.
Yeah, oh man, I'm going to time box myself because I could spend the day talking with you about this. There's a couple of things that have come to me through questions just in private messages that I'll also get to if you don't mind. This reminds me, the screens you were showing me remind me of another project that I would have loved to talk about, where we did a desktop refresh of 19,000 machines for a company called Downer EDI through the RHEL division and other areas, and I can publicly talk about that because it's an open project. And what we found, there were 3 separate desktop refreshes and SOE refreshes running in parallel for some reason, and I ended up just bringing them all to a halt and starting from scratch with an automated tool. And one of the interesting things when we did something of that scale, and I'm going to come back to you with a question in a second, when we did something of that scale, what happened is I got out of the engineering team and out of the CIO's office, and I walked around the rest of the business and said, we're running an audit of everything in this organization from the desktop down. What would you like to know about it? And no one really asked any questions. So then I had some brown bag sessions where I got them in a couple of boardrooms and said, let me just ask the question again. So finance, can you tell me every single piece of software we've ever bought and how much we paid for it and when that kind of gets to end of life and when you can write that asset off? And can you get it off to P&L and GL? Where is your asset management around this? And how do we manage budgeting for software licensing for next year? Glazed eyeballs. And I went through all the other groups. So I'm keen to get some insight in what you've seen in these spaces where you've obviously got a great tool that does an enormous amount of powerful things across just asset management, asset discovery. But what's the reaction been to the sorts of scenarios where you've run a project or you've had a client run a project and all of a sudden, finance and engineering and DevOps and security and compliance and licensing and even some shadow IT environments pop up and say, we had no idea this was here and how do we get access to the data? I'd love to hear about any kind of eureka moments that organizations have had in that scenario and what they've done about it.
So I'll throw in one, Des, and then Chris, if you want to. I think what we see time and time again, Des, is obviously there's always an entry point, right? There's a group inside an organization that says, I need this clean data for a use case. And like any solution provider, that's typically where it comes in. And I would say probably 65–70% of the entry points for us tend to be around asset management. They tend to be around ITAM. We're not an ITAM tool. At the end of the day, what we are is a data management tool. And we feed ITAM solutions like the ones inside ServiceNow, and and other more complex solutions like Flexera and Snow. But at the end of the day, what begins to happen is once that clean data becomes utilized and presented inside other IT organizational meetings, people go, where did you get that? Oh, it came from here. Really? Well, can I take a look at that? And then when they find out that you can begin to attach or enhance the assets with additional content data, and that's something that's very, very unique to BD&A, that's when the aha moments begin to open up. So one of the reasons why we like to show the security piece is because Verizon did a study a couple of years ago, and basically they came back and said 99.9% of all hacks that go on in the environment are coming in through pieces of software that are out of date, haven't been patched, and or are end of life. And most of those are somewhere between 3 months and a year out of date or out of life. And so by having that information in advance, security departments can now be proactive in their approach to preventing breaches. Chris, did you have any that maybe you want to parse in from your travels?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll kind of meld a couple of stories together and talk about how, two aha moments are trying to understand where they're getting the data from. And many customers don't realize the breadth of data that's available out there, whether it's from SCCM or Casper or, you pick the tools, right? And the intent there is to be able to get good data from all of your tools. Well, how do you aggregate that, right, without BD&A? And so that's the first aha moment is wow, we can take all of this data that we have, aggregate it together, and then finally the second piece of the aha moment is the enrichment side. And it's the ability for people to make, truly actionable decisions based on the data rather than trying to find supporting information in the data to support decisions that they've already made. So it turns the tail around on them. I had a customer up in the Tennessee area who literally, once they were able to perform this, I think it was the first or second week that they had this installed, were literally dancing on their desks and cubicles because they didn't know the full breadth of their data, and now they did. Back to you guys.
The enrichment piece is interesting to me, just quickly on that, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Robin Bloor. I do a lot of work with banks and wealth management firms, and there are a couple of key things that they put themselves through on a regular basis in an attempt to stay compliant with a range of challenges. And there's, know your client, or KYC. There's anti-money laundering, AML. And what I'm finding now is a lot of these organizations, when they get good at the KYC process, so know your client process, they more often than not look inwardly and treat themselves as a client. And I'm seeing a number of them now use not the depth that you've got here, but very high-level tools to try and map who their end users are as a client and what they're using because of the reasons you're talking about. Some people just come with BOID, some people got old versions of software, they invariably bring bad things with them to work. In the journey you've had, have you had any specific examples where people have taken the data you've got and applied sort of an enrichment process where they then take a subset of the data and feed into something else? So maybe it's a mapping of who's actually using a system in the first place and what software, and mapping that against HR, for example, to see if all the people that are using systems are actually employed and supposed to be in the building. And other examples of, has somebody installed something on their own machine that they shouldn't have, and how do we capture that? Have there been any examples where other different parts of the business that you wouldn't traditionally think would get value out of the data have taken a subset or gotten access to it and added value to it to get a seemingly unrelated value that they saw come out of this work?
Thomas, if I may, I'd like to jump on this one first. I've got two customers that I'm thinking of specifically. One is in the medical field, hospitals, and they do exactly that. They'll take this enrichment data against their discovery data. They'll bring in Active Directory, and then from that, they know what assets actually belong on their network. from there, they can determine, who should and should not be patched, who should and should not, even be on their network, and then can keep a list for their guest access and whatnot. The second is actually, specifically a couple of different customers are specifically taking this data, and I've never been in the enterprise architecture world, so it is relatively new to me for the last 2 years. But there's an entire use case to be able to take our end-of-life data or other asset-enriched data and pump that out into other enterprise architecture tools that will do the enterprise mapping and things that enterprise architects do. And, quite frankly, that's a part of the industry that has become very popular with our data, and I'd never seen that before. Tom?
Well, I think to add to that, two use cases that I think have popped up pretty quickly are both kind of in and around HR. Basically, to help understand what the internal employees of the company are utilizing. I always find it amazing when clients come back, and this literally happens every time they run. Probably their first normalization is they'll find, probably a good example is, 12 or 14 different Xboxes that are connected to the network, which are typically not sanctioned devices in the business environment unless you work at Microsoft, right? So finding devices that shouldn't be in the environment, finding software that shouldn't be in the environment, and then secondly, I've seen HR quickly utilize this to help value the investments that they have to make in the onboarding process with a new employee. They had no idea that the average employee might have somewhere in the vicinity of $2,500 to $3,000 worth of software and in excess of $5,000 worth of just IT investment around.
There's another use case. It's not so much a question, but just a point to throw out to share. I've had scenarios where we've had very, very large audits of environments. We found legacy systems that the people who originally put them in place and the people who are maintaining them had moved on, and no one had documented it, no one had mapped it. And, very weird things. In one case, I found a steel manufacturer that had an old group of 486 desktop PCs connected to modems, used to do dial-up to the bank every day. And this organization was a multi-billion-dollar steel manufacturer here in Australia. And they didn't realize that these little 486-based DOS PCs were doing the FPOS sort of banking dial-up every day. And the second one that was a more interesting one was in a rail train builder manufacturing warehouse environment. They had a system that they thought was a simulator for train monitoring. It turned out it was actually the live system on an old AIX RS6000 IBM machine. And luckily, those things just don't die, because for nearly a decade, none of the staff that implemented it was supporting it had actually left the company. The department had been shut down, and they'd forgotten it was running. But there were trains driving around the place with this thing talking to it all day and capturing and monitoring. So I think there's some really interesting use cases that quite often people looking forward don't tend to think about, that if they stopped and looked backwards, they'd see some very interesting things as well. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Robin, because I've taken up way too much of your time. Sorry.
Robin, take it away.
Okay, well, we're kind of running out of time. So, I mean, one of the things that interests me is actually the purchase of a product like this. It's just, if you could speak to this, how many people come to you or, come to this product because they've got a very specific problem on their hands? How many actually come for strategic reasons because they just realize that they actually should have something like this, and what they've got is either fragmented or useless? That's part of the question. The second one is, having adopted this for a specific tactical reason, how many people make it strategic from then on?
Well, that's a great question, Robin. I mean, I think it's human nature to be reactive, right? So I would have to say that a good 95 out of 100 times when clients come to us, it's reacting to a situation that has driven them to acquire a solution. And the one that's just absolutely driving companies nuts these days is the auditing process. They're seeing bills. I literally have heard of customers receiving bills from software vendors in excess of $1 billion before audit. And you can only imagine what a CIO and a CFO say when they see that. How could this have happened, and why don't we have better control on this, right? So people become very reactive to that. Now, I can also tell you that in some of those situations, once they got their hands around what they actually had, it turns out that the vendors were a little aggressive in their approach to what they thought was in the environment. And in one particular case, in several particular cases, I've seen clients go from very, very large pre-audit estimates to not owing the suppliers any money at all. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that they clean this data up, right, and doing it in a manner that's very systematic and standardized. There are a lot of companies that try to approach this thing from a manual process, and it's consuming. A traditional audit takes about 1,000 to 1,500 man-hours to prep for. So really, to get down to the thrust of your question, I think a lot of companies come to us, the majority come to us with a hot problem. And then I think ultimately, as they become more mature in their understanding of what they have and what they can utilize it becomes more strategic. But that's one of BD&A's roles once a client has made the investment, is to make sure that they understand and leverage that investment across their operation.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let me throw one last question over to you, because obviously there are existing tools out there at some organizations, and someone is texting me right now. Is there a natural process to migrate from multiple systems already in place to using your BD&A solution as the single source of truth, so to speak? What does that look like? How long does it take? It sounds pretty challenging, but you tell me.
Chris, let me make a quick comment, and then you can kind of talk about the technical side of it, right? I mean, we've seen clients with as few as, one or two discovery solutions to as many as 25. And to bring them all in and aggregate them, that is what the normalized component of our tool set does. How we do that is really a combination of standardized connectivity, and then in some cases we have to build out some custom extractors. But Chris, do you want to kind of maybe iterate on that and explain kind of how we do that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. We have 54 out-of-the-box extractors that we do use to pull that inventory data out of your existing solutions. And then we have, a myriad of options to bring in some homegrown solutions, potentially, if you've got them, say, in Excel or another database. We've seen that as well. And, that aggregation process really isn't that long to set up and stand up. Typically, 2 to 4 weeks, and we've got your solution stood up. And you're getting data not far and not too far down the road thereafter. What we're going to end up doing is after the aggregation and deduplication, we're going to marry that data, that good clean data, up with Technopedia and enrich that. Finally, we'll pump that into a SQL or Oracle data cube. And that data cube is then what is pumped out into wherever else you'd like to see that data, or again into BD&A Analyze like you saw today. Again, focusing on we're not trying to replace where you're getting the data, and we're not trying to replace where the data goes, simply around, the deduplication and enrichment and providing good quality data. I hope that answers the question. If not, please feel free to ask more.
No, that sounds good, folks, and we've gone a good bit over time here, but we always like to have a complete conversation, and the folks from BD&A just sent me this list here. I put this link in the chat window, and you can see that's a rather comprehensive list of different connectors that they've got there. So, folks, I have to tell you, we're going to wrap up here. We do, of course, archive all these webcasts. You can go to insideanalysis.com. Typically goes up the next day. We'll also pass on some of the detailed questions that some folks sent in to us. We'll pass those on to the speakers today, and feel free to reach out to them, or, of course, to yours truly. You can hit me up on Twitter at Eric_Cavanaugh, or of course by email, ek@mobiusmedia.com or eric.cavanaugh@blurgroup.com. Big thank you to our friends at BDNA. Big thank you to our friends at Marketree for helping us bring you this content. And of course, big thanks to, and this is funny, to Techopedia and to Technopedia, because Techopedia is the media partner that we've got. A wonderful, wonderful website. Go to techopedia.com, and then Technopedia is the website that the folks at BDNA have put together. So this is great material, folks. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We have a lot of webcasts coming up in the next couple of weeks, so hopefully you won't mind hearing my voice too much. And with that, we're going to bid you farewell. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.